Wilma Cruz Pinedo was born in 1992 in the city of Huánuco in northern Peru. She grew up in a large family with 8 children. When she turned 20 in 2012, she decided to move to Lima, the capital of the country. Her family lived in a rural area, so Wilma thought it would be better to move to the city to find work and support them financially. She sent all the money she earned as a maid in Lima to her parents to use for her younger siblings' education. Wilma had many dreams for her family. She brought her parents to tears many times and also returned to her hometown to bring them gifts and money. She had dreams and wishes not only for her family, but also for her personal life. She always dreamed of becoming a singer. According to her parents, she had wanted to be on stage since she was a child. To realize this dream, Wilma attended a music school in central Lima in 2015. According to her teachers, she had a bright future ahead because she had a very good voice, was charismatic on stage, and was very diligent. They said that Wilma had clear goals and always kept them in mind, thinking that her triumph on the Peruvian stage was likely imminent. While studying and working, she had time to communicate on a social network where she met a man named Franklin. Initially, Franklin was interested in communicating with Wilma's cousin, but after meeting Wilma, he decided to keep in touch with her instead. After some time, they started dating and began a romantic relationship. Franklin was so close to Wilma that he attended the same school as her, but he studied keyboard and eventually wanted to become a musician. According to friends of the couple, Franklin was a very calm and focused person who would never hurt anyone. It seemed that Wilma had reached all the goals in her life. She was able to financially support her loved ones, was preparing to become an artist, and had found love. However, on October 11, 2017, her dreams and illusions disappeared forever. That morning, she went to work as usual, and at 6 p.m., after completing all her errands, she planned to meet Franklin according to one of her brothers who lived with her in Lima. They were supposed to pick up photos from a photo shoot Wilma had participated in a few weeks earlier. The late evening came, and Wilma still did not appear. Friends and family began to call Franklin because he was the last person she was with, and because he was also her boyfriend. However, he denied having been with her that day. Initially, he told her family that he had not seen her that morning or afternoon, and that they had not spoken that day, which was very strange because Wilma never lied about where she was. At this point, the employer of the girl, who was also very concerned, called the woman who had taken Wilma's photos and asked if she had come for the photos. It was already the next day, October 12, 2017. The photographer told the relatives that Wilma had indeed come around 11 p.m., but not alone. She was accompanied by Franklin, who was known to the photographer because he was the one who paid for the photo shoot. She said they had taken the photos and then left together in a taxi. This was the reason for the family's suspicion towards Franklin, as the photographer's version did not match his at all. In the end, he admitted that he had been with Wilma that evening, but initially denied it because he had been a bit nervous since the girl had not come home. However, he then told a completely different story than his family believed. Franklin said that after taking the photos, he said goodbye to Wilma at the plaza and called a taxi to go home, while the girl decided to walk. It should be noted that it was about midnight when Franklin, according to his story, left Wilma at the plaza. The relatives of the missing girl found this very strange, as it is not normal to leave a girl almost at midnight alone in the plaza. Therefore, they began to scrutinize Franklin more closely and monitor each of his actions. During the search for Wilma, another detail emerged. One of her cousins mentioned that the girl had received threats from an unidentifiable number a few days earlier. It was an anonymous number that informed her that she did not know who she was contacting, that the person sending the messages was a very important person, and a long list of other threats. So, there were 2 lines from relatives. Either Franklin was responsible for her disappearance, or the person who was threatening her. Each time they tried to call the police for help, they were told to wait, because Wilma had probably gone away with a man she had met and was most likely elsewhere. Therefore, the family decided to start searching for the girl independently. They hung posters with her photo on almost every street in the city, asked people if they had seen her, and also went to places where she used to hang out to see if she was there. But all this helped nothing, and months passed without any news from Wilma. As a result, 2017 ended without any news about the girl. The last time Wilma was seen, or had any indication that she was alive, was when a surveillance camera from a store near the house where she worked captured her at 6 p.m. leaving the store. You can see the girl looking into the camera, and then a camera nearby films her from behind as she walks down the street alone. This was the only proof that Wilma was outside that day, but it was not conclusive because it was near her workplace. Only in January 201K did the investigations move forward, but not in the form hoped for by Wilma's family. KM from Paso, on a stretch of road that served as a thoroughfare, a suitcase was found on January 8, 2018. A couple stopped there to take photos against the background of a beautiful sunset. Then the smell of decay began to attract their attention, and as they followed the smell, they saw a suitcase. Before opening the suitcase, which looked old and dusty, they decided to call the police. Security officers who arrived at the scene opened the suitcase and were shocked. Inside, they found the body of a young woman. Since the discovery was so shocking, various speculations appeared in the media. Initially, it was said that a burnt body had been found in the suitcase, but the authorities later denied this, stating that the body was in a state of strong decay. It is assumed that the body had been there for about 2 months. They established this hypothesis because they examined the insects found in the suitcase, and thus had an idea of when the body might have been left there. It was also known that the body belonged to a woman between the ages of 25 and 35. At this time, there were many cases of missing women with these characteristics in Lima, so identification was very difficult. However, with the help of fingerprints, it was still determined that the found body belonged to Wilma Cruz. To be absolutely sure, besides fingerprints, other methods of identity confirmation were used. Before her disappearance, Wilmer had gone to the dentist to have a tooth removed, and this tooth was also missing. In addition, she had suffered a collarbone fracture as a teenager, which was also visible on this body. In the end, a DNA test was performed to confirm the identity, which turned out positive. Now the officers had to find out what had happened to the young woman, how long she had been there, and most importantly, who had done it. A thorough autopsy was not possible due to the state of decay, so it was assumed that the main cause of death was suffocation. However, there was no way to determine this at that time. A toxicological test was also performed, and it was found that Wilma was neither drunk nor under the influence of illegal substances at the time of her death. Then the investigations into the murder of the girl began, and as usual, they started with her partner, Franklin. During the months-long search for Wilmer, the police became very suspicious of the man who did not cooperate in any way with everything that was done. He did not participate in her search and continued to live his life as if nothing had happened. Also, his alibi began to crumble. Franklin said he had spent the night of October 11th at the house of one of his friends, but this friend stated that he had not even seen the man that day. The police began to consider him the main suspect. The officers could access his text messages and social media posts, which showed that he had arranged to meet Wilma that day. They also checked the cameras at the plaza where he supposedly left the girl, and none of them showed that the couple was there at all. Days after the discovery of the body and 1 day after the identification, Franklin was arrested as the only suspect in Wilma's death. In his first statements after his arrest, the man said he did not know what had happened to the girl, he had no idea what she had been through, and he was completely innocent. But the police began to corner him, showing him messages, phone calls, and the statement of his friend that he had not been there that evening, and little by little, the man broke down. Wilma's family and friends said that whenever they asked Franklin about her, he was always very nervous. We must also remember that he first said he had not seen her, and a few hours later, he said he had been with her. The photographer who took the girl's photo also told the police that the man had threatened her a few days after the disappearance and said she should not talk about him coming with Wilma because if she did not reappear, it would all be his fault. In the end, after all this, Franklin had no choice but to admit his guilt. He said that he had killed Wilma on October 11th, 2017. They had arranged to meet around 7 p.m., then they spent some time together, talked a little, went for a walk, and then took a taxi to take photos, went to the photographer's house, looked at the work, liked it very much, and left there happily. In the taxi, Franklin invited Wilmer to come to his house. She agreed, and both went to the room he had rented in a 3-story house. Then they began to call the girl on her phone, which Franklin did not particularly like. According to him, Wilma did not answer calls, but sent text messages, and he also saw that she was sending several messages on social networks. Franklin said that at that time he became very jealous, yelled at Wilma, and that the argument then turned into a fight. To defend herself, she hit him in the face, after which the man got angry, grabbed her by the neck, and began to choke her. According to his statements, he remained in this position for about 2 minutes, until he realized that the young woman was no longer alive. When he realized what he had done, he took a suitcase he had at home and put Wilma's body in it. Franklin then called a friend named Oscar, who was a taxi driver, and asked him to help him take his suitcase to a deserted place. The man says that the taxi driver knew about the suitcase but did not know what was inside. Franklin paid Oscar 300 Peruvian soles for the trip and went to a very remote area where the suitcase was found and hid it in a place where he believed it would never be found. He did not suspect that a few months later, a young couple looking for the perfect place for a photo shoot would stumble upon it. After Franklin left the suitcase at this place, he returned to the taxi, went home, and continued to live as usual. He was asked if he regretted his deed, and he answered that this was not the case. There was a reconstruction of the events in which Franklin had apparently been involved, and various tests were conducted, including a luminol test in the man's room, which showed various bloodstains, so it is assumed that Franklin had beaten Wilma very brutally before choking her. After all the processes, the court in Lima in September 2019 sentenced this man. Wilma's family requested a life sentence. They talked about it in many media outlets and made it clear that they wanted this man to spend the rest of his days in prison. However, it turned out that the opposite was the case. The man was found guilty, but only had to spend 18 years in prison and pay compensation to his family. Franklin took Wilma's life because he felt that she belonged to him. He stole her dreams, took Wilma's parents' daughter away from her siblings, the person who had helped them move forward. Ultimately, Wilma was the breadwinner of her family and the one who helped them survive. Franklin said he did not regret what he had done. Many believe that he had been planning this for some time, and the psychological profile presented in court showed that he was a possessive and very calculating person. It is also known that Franklin had shown some signs of violence towards his ex-girlfriends. Before society, however, he always pretended to be a very calm person. Those who knew him believed that he would not hurt a fly, but it turned out that this was not the case.
The sudden disappearance of Kathy Horn from Traverse City, Michigan, was the beginning of a confusing and mysterious story. No one understood how something like that could happen here in the small, quiet town. The police had many theories at first. They thought the 16-year-old girl might have been fascinated by music and followed a group of nomads traveling with her favorite rock band. Then it became known that Kathy worshipped Satan and practiced black magic, and the officers suspected she might have been sacrificed. But what really happened to Kathy? Traverse City lies on the shore of Lake Michigan and attracts many tourists throughout the year. Here, you can enjoy all the colors of autumn. It is a very popular vacation destination, a great place to live and work for anyone who loves nature. In the fall, these places are particularly beautiful. At that time of year, many businesses offer tours to Traverse City, and even those with the most sophisticated tastes will find something they like. Traverse City is known as the world capital of food, and you can find everything your heart desires. The entertainment industry is also strong, offering music, culture, and all the advantages of a big city. It was to this ideal place that Janice moved in 1991 after marrying her husband, so she could start a new life in Traverse City with her daughter, Kathy Horn. She chose this city because it was quiet and very peaceful. In the fall of 1994, Kathy finally fell in love with her new home. Janice would wake up every day at 3 in the morning and head to her job at the nearest bakery to bake muffins. They lived in the tourist part of town, almost on the lake. Kathy loved it there. If the 16-year-old wasn't in school or at the beach, she spent her time with her school friends. Kathy enjoyed being around people and quickly made friends. They loved her and she loved them. Kathy also wanted to be successful in the future. She planned to go to university and make her love of the natural sciences her profession. She loved dolphins and wanted to become a marine biologist. She was just beginning to discover who she was as a person and had wonderful plans for the future, but she was not destined to fulfill those dreams. On September 26, 1994, around 3 p.m., Kathy's best friend, Jenzara, stopped by her house after school and asked her mother where Kathy was. Janice immediately became worried because Kathy was supposed to spend the weekend at Jen's place, go to school on Monday from there, and then come back home after school. Janice didn't understand what was going on. Jen then confessed she hadn't seen Kathy in the last 2 days. Jen told her that on Friday evening after school, she had driven Kathy to the neighboring town of Gaylord. They stopped in Mansalona and picked up 3 other friends of Kathy. In Gaylord, the friends went to a popular cafe that teenagers liked for its music and good atmosphere. Jen said that around 2:30 a.m., some of their acquaintances wanted to go home while she wanted to stay longer. This meant Kathy and the others had to find their own way back to Traverse City. Janice immediately asked with whom they left, and Jen said they went with a man named David. The girl did not know his last name. She only knew that he worked part-time at various places in Gaylord, including that coffee shop. Janice feared the worst, probably like all parents would. Without wasting a minute, she rushed to the Traverse City police station in a panic with Jen to file a missing persons report. Every year, the police receive hundreds of similar reports, and just because a teenager hasn't checked in for a while doesn't mean something terrible has happened. But Janice was sure her daughter would never run away from home. While the mother was filing the report, Jen told the police officers who Kathy had been with that Saturday night, David and 3 other friends, Tyler, Carrie, and Jim. But the girl had no valuable information about them. She didn't even know their last names. Traverse City is a small town with a low crime rate, so there were only 2 investigators. One of them was Dan Hill, who was tasked with finding the people who had been with Kathy before she disappeared. According to him, there is always a problem when dealing with teenagers. They don't really know names or addresses and have no idea about one another's acquaintances. Since every minute counted, Kathy's details were immediately entered into the missing persons database, and a hotline was set up to gather information. Investigator Hill checked all of the girl's bank records and found some alarming information. She had not withdrawn even a single cent from her savings account. If someone is on the run, they typically take all their money with them and don't leave it in the bank. It began to look like something really had happened to her. The police issued a missing person announcement and asked the public for any information about the girl's whereabouts. It was published in newspapers, broadcast on the radio, and shown on TV. The information that came in varied widely. None of it was concrete. Some believed the girl ran off with her new boyfriend. Others thought she simply didn't want to go to school. Some even reported seeing her in a parking lot in Vanderbilt, 120 km from the city. It was simply impossible to make sense of it all. Investigator Hill decided to turn the case over to the Michigan State Police because they had more resources to conduct the investigation. The case was assigned to Kevin Day, an investigator with 15 years of experience. In 95% of missing persons cases, they run away voluntarily or leave with someone. But the fact that the girl was only 16 and had not returned to her mother alarmed the officers. While other investigators searched for David from the coffee shop, Investigator Day interviewed Kathy's mother and tried to find out who else was close to her daughter. Janice said Kathy had been in a relationship for 6 months with a 20-year-old named Eric Keston, and they had recently broken up. According to the mother, the girl took this relationship very seriously. Kathy was young and had unconsciously fallen in love. He was too old, and Janice disapproved of their relationship. But it wasn't just his age that bothered her. The main issue was that he was involved in the occult. Eric and Kathy were somehow involved in what people called black magic, which set off alarm bells for the investigators. The police contacted Eric and asked him to come to the station for questioning, which he immediately agreed to do. In most of these crimes, it's usually committed by the person closest to the victim, often a husband or lover, so Eric was the first suspect. However, he had nothing to hide and was worried about Kathy's disappearance. The officers asked him why he and Kathy had broken up. Eric explained they had simply drifted apart. Then they asked where he was on the day Kathy disappeared. He said he had gone with friends to Grand Rapids for the weekend and provided names of people who could confirm this. The investigators also wanted to know about his involvement with the occult. Eric said he was a magician, as was Kathy. He then described the initiation ceremony they performed around a large bonfire. He claimed they wore long robes and chanted. Eric also spoke about the Book of Shadows, human sacrifices, and autumn equinoxes. He explained that if a ritual gave power to the cult members, it was entirely justified. He also revealed that a certain Tim Coppett had set fire to the wine, and everyone then drank from the sacred chalice. He said the officers definitely needed to talk to Tim, because he knew that Kathy was being prepared for something big. Tim was the leader of this so-called sect. Could black magic and human sacrifice have been the cause of Kathy's disappearance? The small town of Traverse City, Michigan, was slowly gripped by panic. All the residents suffered under the uncertainty that surrounded them. Usually, it's in big cities that girls go missing, and it felt impossible that something like this could happen here. But terrible things can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone. The police questioned Kathy's ex-boyfriend, Eric Keston, and established that he had been 3 hours away from her at the time of her disappearance. They no longer suspected him, but they weren't as sure about Tim Coppett. Eric insisted that Tim was in charge of the gatherings for the sect both he and Kathy belonged to. Perhaps Tim knew what happened to Kathy. The investigators searched there for clues, as many pieces of information pointed in that direction. But first, they had to clear the people who had been with Kathy in her last hours before she disappeared. The police had suspects, David and the others who had been with Kathy that night. They focused on locating them. While the police in Gaylord questioned people at the cafe, Michigan State Police investigators went to Traverse City High School to talk to Kathy's friends. None of her friends had seen her since Friday, and no one knew where she might have gone. But the investigators discovered something important. One of the students knew David, who occasionally worked at that cafe, and said his last name was Chinky. He drove a green van and lived in Gaylord on Halfman Lake Road. After identifying David, the officers drove to that address. When they finally found him at a friend's house, the 30-year-old was very surprised to learn that Kathy was missing. He was willing to answer all of the police officers' questions and told them he had indeed seen Kathy and 3 other people that night. When asked, he said he barely knew Kathy and had only seen her a few times at the cafe. He added that around 1 a.m. on Saturday, he had offered to act as chauffeur because Kathy's friend Jen said she was with a man and didn't want to leave so early. She arranged for David to drive Kathy back to Traverse City, dropping off 3 other passengers she knew in Mansalona on the way. David then described the route they had taken and said that once they got to Mansalona and dropped the 3 people off, He was going to drive Kathy back to Traverse City, but on the way, she asked to get out. She said she wanted to continue on with them. He pulled over, let her out, and never saw her again. Then he simply drove back to Gaylord. Investigator Day had no reason at first to doubt David's words, but when he noticed cuts on his arm, he became suspicious. David claimed he had cut himself on the side mirror of his car. When the investigators asked permission to search the vehicle, he agreed. It was a large, outdated model, obviously not in the best condition. The officer was looking for anything else suspicious, especially wanting to verify that the mirror was indeed broken. It was, just as David had said. So it turned out he had apparently cut his hand accidentally. There was no sign of Kathy in the van. Investigator Day then asked David to reconstruct the path he had taken to pick up the teenagers. David described which roads they had traveled on with his passengers. The investigators then asked him to take a lie detector test, which he did. Before they left, the officers asked David directly if he knew what had happened to Kathy. His answer shocked them. David believed something occult was involved. He advised the investigators to talk to Tim and hinted they should look at all the sect members. David claimed Tim lived just 30 km south in Waters Township, Michigan. With this new information, Investigator Day left David and gave him a business card. The name Tim Coppett and his description as the leader of a sect had already come up in the case, and Day felt he had to meet the man. One thing was clear. It wasn't just Coppett's reputation that was eerie. Even the road leading to his house was unsettling. Off the highway, there was a star painted on the door, similar to a satanic symbol. As the investigators approached the front door, they wondered if they might be walking into a killer's hideout. Maybe Kathy had come here, and something terrible happened to her. When the door suddenly opened, the investigators saw something that shocked them deeply. 10 days had passed since the 16-year-old Kathy Horn had disappeared on September 24, 1994, near Traverse City, where she lived. The whole town rushed to help search for her, especially her terrified mother, Janice. The investigators hoped that Tim Coppett, the leader of the local satanic gatherings Kathy had allegedly attended, could answer all their questions. When the police officers arrived at Tim's house in the woods, they could hardly believe their eyes. Inside hung many long, colored satanic robes. They also saw a picture of a raven and some strange star diagrams. It was obvious to the investigators that these items were used for devilish rituals. Tim did not deny that he was the leader of the Hawthorne cult, whose followers worshiped the forces of nature. He claimed they worshiped the cosmos as a whole, and he insisted he had nothing to do with black magic or Satanism, which would include human sacrifices and all else connected to that. He was very evasive in answering questions about what they actually did during their gatherings. The investigators found it suspicious that Tim's house was only about 10 miles from where Kathy had supposedly gotten out of David's car. Could he have been the one who kidnapped her for some magical ritual? Tim swore he had nothing to do with Kathy's disappearance and said he had last seen her 2 weeks earlier. Asked where he was on Saturday, September 24, he said he had spent the weekend at home. Tim then voluntarily took a lie detector test, which he passed. As a result, he was officially dropped from the list of suspects. The next day, the investigators received a tip that changed the direction of their search. The police in Mansalona had spoken to several people and learned the names of those who had been in the car with Kathy that Saturday night: Tyler Heath, Carrie Britt, and Jim Patterson. The police checked all three. Britt and Patterson were not considered suspicious, but Tyler's background surprised them. 3 years earlier, he had pleaded guilty to negligent homicide and spent 6 months in jail. At that time, Tyler was around 19 or 20 years old. He had no fixed occupation or place to work. The police wanted to question Tyler and went to his house in Mansalona. He admitted he had been in David's car that night with his girlfriend Carrie, Kathy, and Jim. He told the officers he had offered Kathy a place to stay overnight, but she absolutely wanted to go back to Traverse City. When asked why she insisted, he said she had told him she wanted to go to a Grateful Dead concert and needed to meet up with friends. Tyler said they watched the van drive down the road without stopping. Investigator Day was left wondering whether Kathy had gotten into trouble before she could catch up with her friends or whether Tyler might be lying. Day then asked him about the cult Kathy was involved in, but Tyler said he knew nothing about it. It seemed Tyler had nothing to hide. The police asked him to take a lie detector test, which he passed. Based on the personal interviews and test results, Investigator Day was convinced Tyler had nothing to do with Kathy's disappearance. Still, Tyler wasn't the only passenger that night. The next day, police questioned his girlfriend, Carrie. She told them a version of events they had already heard. She basically confirmed what Tyler had said. Carrie denied any involvement in the sect or Kathy's disappearance and also agreed to a lie detector test, which she passed. She was worried about Kathy's disappearance and shared everything she knew. Only one more passenger remained to be questioned, Jim Patterson. He told the investigators the same story. He was open during the interview and essentially repeated what Carrie and Tyler had said. However, Jim mentioned a small detail that completely changed the course of the investigation. He remembered Kathy saying she needed to be in Traverse City by 7 in the morning to meet members of the Rainbow Tribe. But who were the Rainbow Tribe? It turned out to be a group of Grateful Dead fans who traveled around the country following the band. Promiscuous sex and illegal substances were part of their lifestyle. This environment could be dangerous for a young girl. Kathy said they were going to a Grateful Dead concert on Saturday. If she really had joined up with the tribe, the investigators could track them to figure out her movements. They just had to find the tribe first. Jim gave the officers the names of some people Kathy intended to meet. The police realized it wouldn't be easy to find this group of free-spirited nomads, as they were constantly on the move. Still, they inquired about their whereabouts. Kathy had disappeared just before a concert by her favorite band, and Investigator Day had a bad feeling about it. The police had no doubt that something bad had happened to Kathy and were determined to find out exactly what it was. Day continued his investigation and spoke with several of Kathy's close friends, learning the names of more Rainbow Tribe members. Unfortunately, they all claimed the girl hadn't shown up that Saturday. The investigators concluded Kathy never made it to the Rainbow Tribe, though her family clung to the hope that she was still alive. Everyone began to fear the worst. After the police processed thousands of messages from the public, they received another tip that sounded almost like a confession. An anonymous call came in from someone claiming to be Sean Barth. The man said he had killed Kathy Horn. Since it was an anonymous call, the investigators had no details about the confession, so they went to the house of the alleged caller in Grayling, about 40 km south of Gaylord, where Kathy disappeared. However, during questioning, the 17-year-old Sean seemed just as confused as the investigators. They questioned him thoroughly, but he denied all accusations. Sean insisted he was innocent and claimed someone was simply trying to get revenge on him for a stolen snowmobile, though he refused to give the person's name. Because the call was anonymous, the police had no evidence to arrest him. After speaking with Sean, the investigators determined the claim was not credible. Frustrated, they realized the investigation was at a standstill. Kathy did not reappear, and no one knew where she was. Over the next year and a half, the local police and the Michigan State Police continued following leads and reports from various sightings, but the investigation went nowhere. Kathy had too many friends and acquaintances, and she also had a mother who was sure Kathy would have contacted someone if she had left of her own accord. But that never happened. On May 8, 1996, the investigators finally received a significant lead. Several people collecting mushrooms near Hudson Lake Road and Pitcha Road stumbled upon some clothing. At first, they didn't pay much attention to it, but then they found some jewelry. The items included a Red Hot Chili Peppers t-shirt, underwear, jeans, and a necklace with a yin-yang symbol on a leather cord. The articles of clothing were basically rags, only recognizable upon closer inspection. The fact that everything was piled up under a tree seemed suspicious, so they contacted the nearest police post. After examining the clothing, Investigator Day compared the details to Kathy's known information. The girl had been wearing similar clothing when she disappeared. Although the police had found the clothes, they did not find the girl. Investigator Day had mixed feelings at this point. On one hand, it confirmed his suspicion that she was dead. Otherwise, her clothes would not have been found in the woods. Yet it was the one piece of evidence missing to reopen a full investigation. A search team was immediately dispatched to the place where the clothing had been discovered. The officers genuinely believed they would find the body there or close by, especially when they began to dig. But that turned out to be wrong. A few days later, about 10 km west of that spot, another mushroom hunter found something that confirmed their worst fears. From a distance, he thought it was a very large mushroom, but it turned out to be part of a skull covered with leaves. He turned it slightly and discovered more bones, then more parts of a skeleton. The investigators gathered the bone fragments and an intact skull, sending everything to the forensic pathologist. Kathy Horn was found 6 months after her disappearance, and she was identified using dental records. Sadly, the pathologist could not determine a precise cause of death. He could only say the death had happened a long time ago and was likely a homicide. The fact that her clothes were found separately from her body allowed experts to conclude she had been murdered. People don't die 10 km away from their own clothing. Once the remains were identified, the police had to deliver the terrible news to Kathy's mother. She was shocked, yet in a way relieved that her daughter's remains had been found and she could finally bury her. The residents of Traverse City were horrified by the news that Kathy Horn's remains had been discovered in the woods. It was a shock to all of northern Michigan. The remains were found, but the killer was still at large. Despite this accidental discovery and the subsequent questioning, Kathy's murderer was not found for another 3 years. By then, investigators had ruled out all the wrong leads and suspicious individuals, but there were no new clues, and the investigation progressed very slowly. In 1999, the case was reopened when a story about Kathy's murder reappeared in the local newspaper. After reading the article, one man decided to come forward with what he knew. In August 1999, 5 years after Kathy Horn's remains were discovered, a man from the area contacted the police. Having seen the newspaper article about Kathy's death, he remembered her because the article included a photo and details about the events, urging anyone with information to step forward. Paul Ott claimed that in 1994, just a few days after Kathy disappeared, he saw something strange. At that time, he and his wife were enjoying the fall scenery and looking at foliage on Burke School Road when he spotted a green van with the back doors open. Normally, there's nothing unusual about a parked van on the road during that season, as people often go into the woods to pick mushrooms or look at the leaves. But in the open door of the van, he saw a girl leaning against the wall. Not far from the road stood a man holding a shovel. According to Paul, the girl looked pale, almost gray, and that image stuck in his mind. He said the man was digging a hole about 5 meters off the road. Paul didn't know the man but thought the girl could have been Kathy Horn. Paul and his wife tried to call the police from their cell phone but had no reception. Then they drove home, tried to figure out what to do, but ultimately decided against going back. Years later, when they saw the newspaper article, they realized it was the girl they had seen in the van. When Paul finally decided to testify, Investigator Day was skeptical at first. So much time had passed, but he was still relieved to have a witness who had seen an old green van and a girl who might have been Kathy on Pitch Road. the same area where her clothes were found. Paul also described the man. He said he was somewhat short and unkempt. The van was green and very old. The police concluded it was unlikely that such another wreck of a van existed in the entire region. They were convinced it had to be David Chinky's van. But why would David kill Kathy? The investigators found David quickly. He was in prison, serving a 5-year sentence for another offense involving stolen goods. Investigator Day went to the state prison. The officers confronted David with the evidence of his guilt, hoping he would confess. During their conversation, David was visibly scared and nervous but stuck to his version. He had last seen Kathy when she got out of his car. Observing the man's reaction, Investigator Day became certain he was on the right track. He knew David had something to do with the case and that there was more work to be done. To solve the crime, the investigators needed more evidence. They began by combing through old police reports and came across interesting interviews. During the initial investigation in Gaylord, the police had visited a cafe and spoken with an employee who remembered that David would sometimes take trash from the cafe and other establishments in his van to dump illegally in the vicinity where Kathy's clothes were found. But what really caught the investigators' attention was the statement of another employee who recalled seeing Kathy and her friends and that they had left with David. He said David returned about 2 hours later, sat down at a table and drank half a cup of coffee. He acted very quiet, which was not typical for him. The cafe worker also noticed David took a napkin, wrapped it around his fingers, and that he was bleeding. The cuts on the backs of David's fingers matched the suspicious wounds Investigator Day had seen the first time they met. The evidence was piling up, though the investigators still lacked a motive. Then they looked at an interview with David's neighbor, Margaret Drake. Even before Kathy disappeared, David had told her about meeting a 16-year-old girl from Traverse City, explicitly saying he wanted a sexual relationship with her. Margaret also said David did something very strange just a few days after Kathy disappeared. He completely emptied his van and asked her to wash all his clothing. It was the first time he had done so in the 2 months he'd been living there. Based on Paul's testimony, the officers were confident they had enough circumstantial evidence and arrested David for Kathy's murder. Since he never confessed, David Chinky stood trial on November 26, 2001. The prosecution based its case almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. With such cases, one can only piece together the totality of the evidence to try to reconstruct what really happened. The jury was ultimately able to form a picture, even if the evidence was limited. On November 29, 2001, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found David Chinky guilty of murder. He was sentenced to between 35 and 52 years in prison. David Chinky has never spoken about what exactly happened between the time Kathy got into his car and the moment Paul allegedly saw her in the same van. Where did he take her? How did things unfold? How did he keep her captive? This is a secret shrouded in darkness. For the investigators who spent 7 years working on the case, the verdict brought some relief. David Chinky will never kill again. He has been caught. The people of Traverse City may never know exactly what happened, but they do know that this young, free-spirited girl died far too soon, and her mother never recovered from the loss. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.
Love is a beautiful feeling that books, music, and films are written about. However, when it is the perverse love of a disturbed individual, it can be so destructive that it shatters many lives. It is wonderful when dreams come true and everything runs perfectly. The last thing one wants on a day like a wedding is something unexpected, especially if it involves an armed criminal who is ready to kill. In 1979, Gladys Ricart moved to Timbarilla in the Dominican Republic. She was 20 years old at the time, and after a failed high school relationship, she had become a single mother. Her sister Norma lived in the United States, and Gladys dreamed of following her. To make this dream come true, Gladys worked hard to save the necessary amount of money. She cut back on everything and spent all her time working, which finally allowed her to emigrate to the United States. She settled with her sister's family in Manhattan, New York. Unfortunately, phase of her move, she did not have enough money to bring her son. So, her son Davis remained at home with relatives. Immediately after arriving, Gladys began learning English and looking for a job. She worked tirelessly to save the money she needed to bring her child to the USA. In 1983, she finally managed it, and the young mother was reunited with 4-year-old Davis. Afterward, she enrolled in college. She realized that without an education, her prospects improve her chances of finding a good job and building a career. Gladys managed to graduate from the Faculty of Economics and applied her knowledge by working in accounting. She quickly became a top specialist and one of her company's most valuable employees. She gradually rose through the ranks, eventually reaching the position of chief accountant at a large travel agency in the heart of Manhattan. Gladys did not fit the classic image of an immigrant. She had achieved completed an education and found a good job. She was saving up for her own apartment. Indeed, she was fulfilling her American dream. All she was missing was establishing a full family life and finding love. Yet Gladys was very cautious in this area. She seemed to prioritize career success over relationships and marriage. However, that was only the initial impression. Deep down, she dreamed of meeting her better half. In 1992, after living in the USA for every day, in the mornings she took the subway to the office and then back home in the evenings to her sisters. On the subway, she met a man named Agustin Garcia. He was one of the leaders of the Dominican community in the state and a prominent public figure who, at the age of 40, had built a successful career. Like Gladys, he had also come to the United States from the Dominican Republic as a young man. He had come a long way out of poverty and had become a successful entrepreneur. Time he met Gladys, he owned several small businesses and was the father of 2 children from a previous marriage, both of whom lived with him in a large house. However, that was not what made Agustin famous. In the local Dominican community, he held a distinguished position as an honorable man, always willing to help his neighbor. He knew what it was like to emigrate and start a new life, and he wanted to help anyone embarking on that difficult journey with all his heart. Director of the Dominican Chamber of Commerce in New York and of several organizations connected to his homeland. At the same time, Agustin was not just a member of all these organizations. He was also very active in the social sphere. Thanks to his efforts, several kindergartens and schools were opened, and he became a respected and influential member of society. He seemed made for Gladys. She was decisive and compassionate, and one of Agustin's most attractive qualities was his easygoing nature. He behaved like a gentleman, was polite and sociable, and he immediately caught her attention. In fact, their meeting was purely coincidental. Agustin practically never took the subway but happened to be there because his car had broken down. The wealthy businessman was instantly taken with Gladys's beauty and decided to get to know her. They talked for the rest of the ride and then exchanged phone numbers so they could meet again soon. Right after that, their relationship began. Agustin frequently took his beloved to restaurants, treated her to exquisite dishes, and gave her expensive presents. Gladys's family was happy for her upon hearing about this new boyfriend, as he was a worthy candidate for the role of husband and father to her son. The couple dated for over a year before Austin decided he was ready to take the relationship to the next level. He offered Gladys to move in with him, and the young mother willingly accepted the offer, as she confided to her family and friends more than anything else at that time. She dreamed of marriage. Her dearest wish was for Agustin to propose so they could raise 3 children together, Davis plus the children she hoped to have with him. After she turned 33, she finally moved in with her beloved. But from the very beginning, things got worse. Her son Davis had great difficulty getting along with Agustin's children. The boy tried hard, particularly at his mother's, literally begged him in every way possible to get along with everyone. But Agustin's children were arrogant and often provoked Gladys's son into conflict. Unfortunately, they never reached any reconciliation. Meanwhile, Agustin always took his own children's side, even when they were clearly in the wrong. This led to serious tension between the couple. After 2 years of this life and endless arguments, Gladys realized she no longer wanted to put her son through it. She told. Living together wasn't working. Agustin agreed but did not end their relationship. He helped her find a new place to live just 9 minutes away from his house by car. It was a spacious 2-story home, and he spared no expense on the woman he loved. It seemed this was the right step to smooth out the rough edges of their relationship. The couple continued to meet when he visited Gladys. By then, her family had grown so accustomed to Agustin that they practically considered him. The wealthy businessman introduced his beloved everywhere as his wife, even though they were not officially married. Gladys continued trying to persuade him to marry her, but he stubbornly refused, arguing that his previous marriage had failed. He insisted he never wanted to be officially married or have children together again, because he saw no point in unnecessary bureaucratic complications. According to those close to Gladys, over time all of this pushed her happiness in the relationship. Its breaking point. After several years of the couple's romance, the unpleasant aspects of Agustin's personality began to emerge. As it turned out, he frequently had affairs and also began displaying increasingly abusive behavior. The situation started to escalate. Gladys was aware of all this but kept quiet for a long time because she did not want trouble. Unfortunately, her inaction only made the problems in the relationship worse. During another argument, Agustin, Gladys, she managed to lock herself in the bathroom, but at that moment she realized it was time to end her relationship with him. Her fear of this manipulative man prevented her from leaving him for a while, because she wanted a solid reason that would leave Agustin with no counterarguments. The simplest way was to catch the cheater in an affair. The situation escalated in the fall of 1998 when Gladys showed up at Agustin's office and caught him with another. Break up. She immediately told him it was over, moved out of his house, and informed all her relatives so that everyone knew the wealthy businessman was no longer welcome in Gladys's home. Despite the relationship's failure, Austin was not ready to accept such a change. He viewed Gladys as his property, something he had owned for 7 years. After the breakup, he constantly called her and left gifts at her door, bouquets of flowers and even a Bible. Gladys considered to win her back, but her family saw more ominous undertones. The man appeared to be making symbolic gestures with hidden meaning. In any case, the woman did not want to be with him again under any circumstances. Several months passed, and Gladys met a man named James Preston Jor in a restaurant. They met during a lunch break. Her new acquaintance also worked in accounting and on the side was a musician. From the moment they met, there was an immediate connection. After just a couple decided to make their relationship official. For 2 months, James and Gladys spent all their free time together. Finally, a wedding date was set for September 26, 1999. Gladys and her family were thrilled because her long-held dream of a wedding and a white dress was about to come true. Gladys was so caught up in the joys of wedding preparations that she failed to notice how Austin would come to her house almost every night to watch her for hours. His possessive obsession. On August 12, a month and a half before the wedding, Gladys and her fiancé were enjoying a quiet, romantic evening at her house when Austin suddenly appeared at the door. At first, he calmly asked to speak with his ex, but she refused. He then lost control, began shouting, and threw stones at the windows. Worried about further aggression, Gladys called the police. Agustin was taken into custody, but she decided not to press charges, wanting to trouble. She also did not want to be distracted from the wedding preparations, an error that would prove costly. On September 24, just 2 days before the wedding, Gladys went to a store to buy what she needed for the bridesmaids. It turned out she had been followed by her ex-boyfriend the entire time. He cornered her in one of the aisles of the supermarket and hugged her, as if they were close or even still a couple. Gladys did not resist for fear of provoking the stalker. She talked with her ex and then said goodbye. That same evening, she spoke with her future husband and family members, complaining that Agustin's behavior had become disturbing and obsessive. Sadly, she had no idea how dangerous he truly was. The long-awaited day arrived. September 26, 1999. 39-year-old Gladys was at home with her family and friends, getting ready for the ceremony. She was dressed up, had her hair done, and was wearing makeup. The bride-groom. In photos and video, they captured her final moments alive. At that time, the groom was already waiting in the church, but circumstances took a bloody turn. Without any warning, her ex-boyfriend walked into the living room where Gladys was standing. He pulled a .38 caliber revolver from his pocket and shot 3 times at his former partner. The first bullet hit her shoulder, the second hit her spine, and the third hit her head. After the third shot, the victim was killed. Responders who arrived later could do nothing. The woman's dream of a wedding went unfulfilled. The shooter was apprehended immediately and taken to the station. He made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. There, Agustin spoke with one of the investigators. The murderer admitted he had been on his way to his house in Manhattan and decided to drive past his ex's home, something he often did. In his view, this was merely sentimental behavior, though in reality it was nothing less than stalking. On that morning of September 26, he was shocked to see so many people in formal clothes and multiple limousines in front of his ex's home. He had no idea Gladys was getting married. He claimed to be so stunned that he drove back and forth several times before stopping. Agustin still did not know whose wedding it was and decided to go inside to find out what was going on. As soon as he got out of his car, Gladys's brother Juan, who was standing across, cautious because he knew his sister's ex had a bad temper, Juan tried to convince him to leave so he wouldn't ruin Gladys's wedding. Then Agustin realized his ex was marrying another man, but he did not show any reaction. The man got out, said he had been invited to the celebration, so Juan stepped aside and let him go. No one else intervened. At first, Agustin claimed he could not remember anything about the shooting in the house, but a short time later he carried a gun and had brought it inside. Asked why he had massacred an unarmed woman, he refused to answer. The next day, the detainee was taken to a preliminary hearing at the courthouse, where the charges against him were read. He had the chance to plead guilty, avoid a grueling trial, and receive a reduced sentence, but he chose not to. It was decided he would be held with bail set at $5 million, reflecting the enormous threat this criminal posed to society. The friendly, influential man shattered immediately. The attack became a publicized crime due to active media coverage, and the story quickly spread nationwide. Journalists published sensational statements, rumors, and wildly speculative claims. The killer's face started appearing regularly in the national news. The media attention attracted many lawyers, including top specialists looking to make a name for themselves by turning this high-profile murder into a career milestone. The businessman was set for October 2, 2001, giving the defense almost 2 years to prepare their case thoroughly and to craft a favorable image for the accused. The hired lawyers immediately began working with the press, holding press conferences and making public appearances. All of this was designed to shape a particular view of the crime and to portray Agustin as the real victim. One of their first moves was to accuse Gladys's brother Juan and her son Davis of attacking, arguing that the shooter never really intended to kill his ex, but that an accident occurred when he had to defend himself against the aggressive Juan and Davis. At the same time, the defense attempted to tarnish the victim's reputation, portraying the murdered bride as unfaithful and accusing her of multiple affairs. Allegedly, Gladys and Agustin had planned to reconcile, but behind his back, she was preparing to marry another man. Thus, the defense claimed that the gunman fired in a state extreme emotional distress. Austin was shocked to discover the woman he loved was about to marry someone else, even though they had supposedly walked hand in hand through the supermarket just the day before. The next day, Juan allegedly attacked him, triggering the shots. According to the defense, this was a crime of passion, classified under state law as manslaughter, carrying a significantly lighter sentence of 5 to 10 years instead of life in prison. Many people accepted this story, largely because of Agustin's polished reputation. Indeed, he was well known as a caring and compassionate man who worked tirelessly for the Latino community in New York City. As soon as the false rumors spread that Gladys had been unfaithful, public sympathy for her quickly faded. Some people even believed the victim got what she deserved. All this was a tremendous shock to the Rick family. Realizing how much damage the murderer's lawyers were causing, they began attending every conference to defend the good name of the slain bride. The victim's siblings and parents insisted the accusations of infidelity were malicious lies, pointing out that the relationship between the killer and his victim had been over for some time and was never rekindled. Instead, Agustin had continued stalking her obsessively and behaving inappropriately. Yet Gladys's compassion had kept her from pressing charges before the murder. Sadly, he showed no compassion in return. The judge, the defense attorney's activities, officially barred them from further press conferences and media interviews. However, the damage to the victim's reputation had already been done, which posed a problem for the prosecution when the trial began. In court, the lawyers continued to portray the defendant as the victim, slinging every possible form of mud at Gladys's memory. Her family insisted the attack had been premeditated, and they had a vital piece of evidence: the shooting and the bride's death had been captured on video. The start of the celebration and the preparations had been filmed, and Agustin did not notice the camera. When the first hearing began, only the judge had seen the footage. The defense attorney still fought to keep it from the jurors, calling it an unfair advantage for the prosecution. They maneuvered to block the prosecution's most decisive piece of evidence. After lengthy deliberations, the court decided to allow the footage, but only the moment of the bride's shooting was shown, a 15-second clip. The prosecution worried this might not be enough to persuade the jury because the clip was out of context, potentially giving the defense room to cast doubt. They pushed their strategy further, insisting that an abrupt attack by the victim's brother and son had forced Agustin to draw his gun, that the 3 bullets that hit Gladys were fired accidentally. Despite the victim's family protesting, the killer's lawyers insisted it was all tied to her promiscuous lifestyle. They presented several witnesses for the defense, notably a family that lived near Austin who testified in court that they had seen Gladys at his house just days before the incident and believed the two were still living together. In reality, she had only gone to pick up some remaining belongings. This manipulation caused at least some jurors to sympathize with the defendant. Fortunately, the prosecution had an answer, chiefly the video. It was heartbreaking, showing the attacker killing his ex in front of her family members, including her son. Clearly, he was not acting in self-defense. All the shots were aimed at the victim alone. After showing this evidence, the prosecution exposed more weaknesses in the defense's story. Notably, in the 15-second clip, there was no sign of the killer being attacked as he entered Gladys's home. No one even approached him, yet he pulled out his gun and opened fire. He made no attempt to defend it. First moment until the last, his loaded weapon was aimed directly at Gladys. It was obviously a deliberate act of jealous revenge since he came to the house armed. Not only was the gun loaded, but he also had spare ammunition, presumably in case the full cylinder was not enough for the execution. The defense lawyers responded by arguing that Austin was a well-known businessman and wealthy man who might have had enemies, so he always carried a loaded gun for self-protection. Further sought to refute the lies about the victim's promiscuity, pointing out that her ex-boyfriend had stalked her for months after the breakup. Every one of her relatives confirmed this. Even her son feared Austin, aware of his cruelty, and believed his kindness and generosity were nothing but a facade to hide his true nature. The surveillance and unpredictable visits continued right up to the final months. In the trunk of the perpetrator's car, authorities found a list of all belonging to vehicles parked near Gladys's house. He had not only been watching his future victim, but also kept a tally of anyone who came near her. That likely included her neighbor's cars, as well as the car belonging to Gladys's soon-to-be husband. During the deliberations, the murderer made a controversial decision to speak on his own behalf. This move would significantly impact the final verdict. In legal practice, such a choice can either be a disaster or save the 16. Austin spoke in his own defense. The prosecution asked him to describe what happened in Gladys's house. They expected him to repeat his lawyer's account that he had acted in a heat of passion and lost control. Instead, the defendant claimed that he had calmed down when he saw his ex in her wedding dress. According to Agustin, Juan and Davis then attacked him. However, this had already been disproven by the video, in which neither Juan nor Davis laid a hand on him. Defendant insisted that at that moment, He somehow disconnected from reality and couldn't clearly remember firing his gun. He tried to show remorse and even cried, but after the questioning, it came across as unconvincing. On February 1, 2002, Gladys's family awaited the final verdict. After a lengthy trial, the jury deliberated, found Austin guilty of premeditated murder, and sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30. Of Tambaria in the Dominican Republic, her body was transferred to her homeland 1 week after her death, and she was buried in her wedding dress. 1 year after the tragedy, a woman living in Florida wore a wedding dress to run a marathon. In an interview, she explained she did this in memory of Gladys's death and as part of the fight against domestic violence. To this day, various communities in multiple states hold annual bride marches. Sadly, this has not significantly rid problem. Since the trials, Austin has refused to speak publicly or give comments to reporters. It became known that he turned to the gospel after starting his prison sentence and began preaching among fellow inmates. Meanwhile, his lawyers continued to seek a reduced sentence, but several appeals were denied. Austin remains in prison and can apply for parole in 2029. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.
Custody questions are among the most complex and delicate issues in civil law. Sometimes the parents' views on life differ so greatly that they have to turn to a judge. But even then, it is not always possible to find a solution that satisfies everyone involved. In such situations, some even turn to crime. Bianca Edmonds' parents were Ross and Elon. The girl was the second oldest of 4 children in the family, with 2 brothers and 1 sister. When she was young, her father took a job at a mining company, so he was often away on long business trips. This caused a rift in her parents' relationship. Her mother wanted her husband to spend more time with her and the children, but he couldn't refuse this lucrative position. Eventually, the couple separated. After a while, Bianca's mother remarried a man named Bon Edmonds, who also had children from a previous marriage. Because of this, Bianca was often referred to by his last name, Edmonds, though neither the family nor Bianca herself minded, since she had hardly any connection to her biological father in her younger years. However, once she was older and about to graduate from school, she reconnected with him and they developed a close bond. After finishing secondary school, Bianca joined the Australian Navy, but sustained a back injury during a training exercise a year later. She was discharged for medical reasons. After her recovery, she hopped from one job to another, mostly in retail Lunable, to stay in one place for long. In 2007, she had her first son, named Tyler. He was born after she began a relationship with a man called Dirk, but Dirk had no interest in family life or children, so the couple separated. He showed no concern for his son's life, and the child spent most of his time with his mother and her relatives. By this point, Bianca had become a mature woman who knew what she wanted, dreaming of reliable support and a comfortable life. In early 2012, at the age of 26, she met Michael Capasiena. He was already 35 by then, and his financial standing matched Bianca's ambitions perfectly. She acted quickly, the relationship progressed, and they married the same year they met. At the end of 2012, Bianca became pregnant again, and on the 3rd of June, 2013, she gave birth to a son she named Luca. Despite this fast development, the relationship was toxic from the start. Michael repeatedly complained that his wife tried to control everything, which felt very limiting to him. They argued constantly and, soon after the baby's birth, decided to end the marriage. In early 2015, Bianca met 48-year-old Glenn Cassidy via the Tinder dating app. As usual, she acted quickly and rashly. She realized that her new acquaintance was very soft in nature, which suited her because she wanted to be in charge of the relationship. An online flirt quickly led to an in-person meeting and intimacy, even though the man was 20 years older than she was. Before he met his young partner, Glenn had been married for 20 years and had 2 children from that marriage. It seemed these parallel details in their lives might help them build a rapport and understand each other better. True to her usual decisive style, Bianca and Glenn married just a few months later, in February 2016. Meanwhile, she was dealing with multiple contentious matters in her personal life, especially the custody dispute with her former husband. In the first months of Luca's life, Michael played only a small role and often refused to meet him. But starting in February 2013, things changed. At that time, Michael began a relationship with another woman, found financial stability, and decided to spend more time with his child, who was then barely a few months old. From March 2014 onward, Luca's biological father asked to see his son, but Bianca wouldn't let him into her life. This led to numerous conflicts in which Bianca leveled all kinds of accusations against her ex, calling him toxic and unfit to be a father. Michael was not deterred, convinced her claims were baseless, so he filed a lawsuit. In August 2015, after several hearings, the court granted Michael the right to see his child, but with strict limitations. He could visit his son in a neutral, supervised setting every 2 weeks for short, 2-hour meetings. These meetings took place in Melbourne, which was 2 hours by car from Shepparton, where Michael lived. Of course, all of this also inconvenienced Bianca greatly. In general, she disliked the idea that this toxic ex would still have any role in her son's life. She wanted to end the connection, but couldn't find a way. To her great frustration, the situation did not improve. Her ex-husband grew more attached to the child and decided to file another petition with the court, now wanting to increase both the length and frequency of his visits with Luca and to do so without supervision. That triggered a new wave of Bianca's outrage and led to numerous fights, some even physical, with each side blaming the other. Michael's and Bianca's partners described completely opposite scenarios. Michael's girlfriend, Savannah, called Bianca a toxic person trying to limit a loving father's contact with his son. According to her, Michael had reevaluated his stance and wanted to connect with his son, and the law was on his side. She described him as a devoted family man with a good heart. Meanwhile, Glenn, who was with Bianca, portrayed his partner's ex as so toxic and cruel that he posed a threat to his own son. Bianca repeatedly told him how Luca's biological father had threatened to kidnap the child and even take him abroad. Over the years she was with Glenn, Bianca talked more and more about getting rid of Michael. First, she turned Glenn against him by saying what a bad father Michael was, but that didn't work as she had hoped. Then she started manipulating Glenn, using physical intimacy as her main weapon. In December 2015, she provoked tensions in the family by refusing to have sex with her husband unless he agreed that her ex needed to die. Even during intimacy, he had to reaffirm that he would commit the crime, but he refused. Then the situation escalated to a new level. A simple relationship with his wife turned into pure pressure, and she called him a coward for failing to solve her problem with the ex and help her. Initially, Glenn tried to brush it off, but it only got worse, and he gradually began to take the idea of killing Michael more seriously, feeling constant pressure. He even took the initiative after his wife suggested making a plan for retaliation. Glenn produced a handwritten, rather superficial list covering the main points. He intended to kill his archenemy with a single gunshot, then go to the victim's house, find a way to transport the body, and hide it. Some lines were nonsensical, such as Morgenstrasse, clearly containing spelling and phrasing errors. Indeed, Glenn's note was riddled with mistakes, suggesting he had obvious literacy problems that later played a significant role. Bianca had a strong bargaining chip to convince her husband to proceed with the crime. Glenn desperately wanted a child with her. Her sexual blackmail worked perfectly. The couple had been having issues conceiving and openly discussed it. They even attempted IVF. Through skillful manipulation, Bianca managed to convince Glenn that once Michael was dead, they would definitely have a child together. After drafting this plan on paper, the criminals started preparing and carrying it out bit by bit. They wanted to find the best place to ambush Michael and drew up a map of the neighborhood where their target lived with Savannah. Bianca knew where and how Michael's house was situated, so she created a detailed plan indicating the location of doors and windows. Their preparations were serious enough that they even figured out the positions of streetlights and which neighbors had dogs that might bark and draw attention. By March 2016, their plan was complete. Bianca was eager to have her ex murdered as soon as possible, but each time they set a date, something went wrong, so they kept postponing it. Glenn kept going to Michael's house to see firsthand how to arrive from different streets and how to make a getaway. During these visits, he called Bianca to tell her about various obstacles that could derail their plan, such as Michael coming home too late from work or being out with friends. They communicated in code, referring to the area around Michael's place as their workplace. Glenn stayed up late several times, waiting for the target, while Bianca urged him on, hoping the man would be killed soon. Yet Glenn was visibly nervous and seemed uncertain. Bianca then used her main weapon, sex, promising him that once Michael was gone, he could have it as often as he liked. Later, the police obtained recordings of all these calls. For unknown reasons, Glenn had installed an app on his phone that recorded conversations, possibly sensing he was being manipulated and hoping to protect himself if it all fell apart. Regardless, it didn't lessen his guilt in the shooting that followed. During the crime, Bianca was supposed to be on vacation in Darwin with Glenn's mother, on the other side of Australia likely, to provide her with an alibi that would convince the police of her innocence. On the 11th of March, 2016, she prepared to leave, going over the plan with Glenn in detail beforehand. On the 12th of March, 2016, Glenn drove 170 kilometers to the victim's house. Bianca received a text from him saying he would take care of Michael for his wife and kids. At 12:23 p.m., he sent another message, declaring his love for her and expressing anger toward his intended victim. Bianca, however, started to discourage him around 1 p.m. that day. Glenn then drove up the driveway to Michael's house, reaffirming one last time how much he loved Bianca and was ready to complete the job. At that moment, Michael and Savannah were relaxing at home, enjoying some time together, returning only around 7 p.m. For the entire afternoon, the killer had been lying in wait nearby, with a clear view of the front door. When they got home, the couple sat down to watch a movie. At 7:18 p.m., Savannah went to the window and saw a man step out of a car and walk along the street toward their house with empty hands. She recognized him, felt confused, and told Michael. It seemed strange, since they lived far from Bianca and her new husband, and she had no idea why Glenn would be there. Glenn saw her too, paced back and forth, then got back in his car likely trying to gather his thoughts. At 7:27 p.m., he got out again, this time carrying a large white bag, looked around, and saw no one. At 7:30 p.m., he knocked on Savannah and Michael's door. His appearance on the doorstep that late seemed inexplicable. Worried, Michael went to the kitchen for a large knife and opened the door while leaving the chain on. The men exchanged a few words. Savannah heard Michael say that he couldn't help. Then Glenn stretched out his hand, supposedly to say goodbye, and Michael responded by shaking it, which proved a big mistake. The killer pulled his hand away and kicked the door in, leading to a violent struggle. Glenn tried to get out a shotgun and aimed it at his opponent's head. Michael fought back with his knife, inflicting numerous stab wounds. Everything happened in front of the terrified woman, whose whole life flashed before her eyes. Glenn apparently wanted to finish off the witness too, but he had forgotten there was only one shell loaded, intended to kill his archenemy. The shotgun clicked, but no shot was fired, as there was no round in it. Realizing he couldn't shoot the witness, he struck her in the head with the butt of the gun, causing her to fall unconscious. It's highly likely Glenn also intended to kill her, but he collapsed onto the floor himself from blood loss due to the knife wounds. By 7:32 p.m., it was over. When Savannah came to, she found both men dead. She called emergency services, saying she had been attacked and her fiancé had been killed. She had suffered a mild concussion from the blow with the gun's butt. Because Glenn was weakened by blood loss, he lacked time to inflict more serious harm on her. The police who arrived at the scene found it a bloody and baffling sight. Savannah gave a detailed account of what had happened, but as the only survivor of the chaos, she was initially their prime suspect. The investigators quickly concluded she had nothing to do with the murders. Soon they located Glenn's car parked on the opposite side of the street, which still contained his lunch chicken schnitzel with green peas. A database check confirmed that the vehicle belonged to the attacker. They examined security camera footage, seized the deceased killer's phone, and looked through his text messages. The entire story was murky from the beginning, so it took 3 whole months for investigators to reach Bianca and realize she was the mastermind behind the killing. Clearly, she thought she had gotten away with it. She was shocked when police showed up at her door. The 29-year-old was arrested in December 2016 and taken in for questioning, at which point she became hysterical. She pretended Glenn had planned the whole thing on his own, and she had tried to talk him out of his fatal mistake, but he wouldn't listen and carried out the plan while she was away. Bianca claimed her husband had been upset about Michael's behavior and blamed him for taking his child, saying Glenn felt robbed of time with Luca. Even the boy wasn't biologically his. The widow alleged that her new husband had long wanted a child and held Michael responsible for not being able to have one. However, law enforcement knew this was a lie. The phone logs of the deceased killer contained text messages and even recorded phone calls laying out their plan for murder, which they had been plotting for months. As an alibi, Bianca pointed to the last message Glenn had sent to her phone, the one professing his love and hatred of Michael, which, she claimed, was the first she had heard of the impending attack, and that she couldn't stop him. But the police spotted a discrepancy. In the note Glenn had written outlining the murder, there were many spelling errors. Yet the text message Bianca showed them, allegedly from Glenn, had perfect spelling too neat for someone with poor literacy skills. Police therefore believed Bianca herself had composed and sent the message from her husband's phone, planting evidence. Still, the suspect denied any involvement, insisting she had never known of the murder plot and had never purchased or even known about the shotgun. Moreover, she hadn't physically been at the crime scene. With insufficient evidence linking her to a specific crime, the police released her while continuing their investigation. During that time, Bianca apparently got bored and went back on Tinder to find new men. Barely 3 weeks after Glenn's death, she met Todd Bookham, an ex-con currently on parole, with a lengthy record involving violence. He had spent about a decade in prison for slitting his first wife's throat in front of their young son. Early in their relationship, Bianca told Todd that Glenn had died of cancer. Just a few weeks later, she became pregnant, but then lost the child. By chance, Todd came across information online about Glenn and Michael and confronted Bianca. She confessed to planning the incident, saying Glenn was never supposed to die. She claimed she only wanted Michael out of the way because she feared he might gain custody of their son and she would never see Luca again. After her confession, Bianca grew hysterical, saying she was terrified the police would figure out her role. Todd went straight to the station and disclosed everything she had told him. In April 2018, Bianca was questioned again. Despite Todd's testimony, she continued to deny sending that text from Glenn's phone, insisted she had never seen any drawing of Michael's house, and denied having planned his murder. The officers then told her they had found her fingerprints on the shotgun used in the shooting. At first, she had no explanation for these facts, and also continued to deny that custody was the central motive for the killing. When investigators mentioned Todd's claims, she said she couldn't remember those conversations. She blamed her depression after losing the baby and the effect of antidepressants. Once again, the police decided there wasn't enough evidence to arrest her, and she was released. This went on until June 2019, when investigators finally felt they had enough proof that she had been involved in either instigating or directly participating in the murder of her 38-year-old ex-husband, Michael. However, the pandemic lockdowns caused further delays in the investigation. Hearings to consider Bianca's role in Michael's murder did not begin until June 2022. The prosecution argued that her motive was not wanting to share custody of the child and fearing that Michael might take him away. Investigators suspected she intended for Glenn to end up in prison too, thus ridding herself of that bothersome man as well. She thought Glenn was too old and that he was starting to annoy her. But the killing went awry, and Glenn died in the process of murdering Michael, which also suited her fine. There is strong evidence that by then she was already looking for a new partner and chatting actively with strangers on dating apps, which is how she met Todd. The prosecution maintained she had composed that incriminating text message in Glenn's name to create an alibi, and that her trip to Darwin was also part of the plan. In addition, audio recordings of their phone conversations and written correspondence were meticulously analyzed. To convince the jury, the authorities presented all evidence found, including a map that Bianca had apparently drawn of Michael's house. Her DNA was discovered on it. Moreover, her fingerprints and footprints were on the murder weapon, a direct contradiction of her interrogation claims. The defense insisted the state only had circumstantial evidence and suggested Glenn hated Michael for trying to be involved in Luca's life. Bianca also continued to claim there was never any dispute over custody and that both parties had acted calmly and cooperatively. But multiple witnesses for the prosecution testified that Bianca had wanted her ex out of the picture for some time because of the custody battle. Even her own mother stated in court that her daughter had called the day after the murder and admitted that Glenn was not meant to die and that it was all her fault. Bianca tried to explain the fingerprints on the shotgun by saying they came from a sexual scenario with Glenn, claiming he became aroused when she threatened him with the weapon, an utterly unbelievable tale that did nothing to justify her lies in earlier interrogations. A few weeks after she began seeing Todd, Bianca discovered she was pregnant again. Todd said he would withdraw his statement if she forgave him and took him back, but Bianca believed someone else was the real father. The jury deliberated on the confusing case but could not reach a unanimous verdict in the first trial, leading it to be declared a mistrial. A second hearing in August that same year was also deemed invalid when certain forbidden arguments were raised in court. In December 2022, the case was finally tried again. This time, all the evidence collected during the investigation was presented, including text exchanges between Bianca and Glenn, in which she talked about celebrating today, a clear sign she was rejoicing in the prospect of the murder. Ultimately, the jury concluded that Bianca was complicit in murder. In essence, through the cunning of this cruel woman, two people died at once, one of them a victim of her manipulation. Everyone was shocked at how deeply Glenn had been influenced before his death. Bianca quickly saw that he was easy to manipulate and used his weaknesses as her main weapon. She wanted to kill two birds with one stone. Although Glenn's death was not originally part of the plan, she had apparently hoped to convince him to take full responsibility so he would go to prison while she walked free. Bianca Edmond was sentenced to 26 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Bianca's children were placed in the care of other family members. Because of their mother's treachery, the children were left without parents. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.